At my late husband's will reading, my daughter-in-law stood up, smiled at everyone in the room, and said the entire estate should go to my grandson because he was the only true heir. She never imagined my husband had left one final envelope that would change everything. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited. What happened next was something no one in that room, not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not even some of our closest relatives, could have predicted. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the very end, and let me know where you're watching from. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel, and I'd love to know where you're listening today. My name is Linda Brooks. I'm 69 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I had lived a life that any woman would have been grateful for. My husband Robert and I had been married for 46 years. We weren't rich when we started. In fact, our first apartment was barely large enough for a small kitchen table and a second-hand sofa. Robert worked long hours in construction while I taught second grade at the neighborhood elementary school. Every paycheck mattered. Every dollar had a purpose. Little by little, our lives improved. Robert eventually started his own construction company. It wasn't a giant corporation, but it earned us a comfortable life. We paid off our home, helped our son through college, and put enough away to enjoy retirement together. At least, that was the plan. Cancer had other ideas. Robert fought harder than anyone I've ever known. Even during chemotherapy, he insisted on walking through our backyard every evening, checking on the roses he had planted himself years earlier. They'll bloom again next spring, he'd always say with that quiet smile. He never got to see that spring. His funeral had been simple, exactly as he wanted. No extravagant flowers, no long speeches, just family, just close friends, just love. Or at least, that's what I believed. Looking back now, I realize grief has a way of blinding you. It makes you overlook conversations that suddenly stop when you enter the room. It makes you ignore nervous glances between people you trust. It convinces you that everyone is hurting as much as you are. Sometimes, they're thinking about something entirely different. After the funeral, my house became painfully quiet. For 46 years, every morning had begun with the smell of Robert's coffee drifting through the kitchen before sunrise. Now the coffee maker remained untouched. His favorite chair still faced the living room window. His reading glasses still rested beside yesterday's newspaper. Some mornings I caught myself listening for his footsteps before remembering there would never be another pair. Kevin tried calling every few days. My son sounded concerned, at least on the surface. He kept asking if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping, if I needed help organizing paperwork. I appreciated his concern. Or at least, I wanted to. His wife, Megan, called more often than he did. Oddly enough, she wasn't asking how I felt. She always had practical questions. Linda, where did Robert keep the property records? Did he ever mention updating his will? Who has the key to the home safe? The attorney still has the original documents, right? At first, I assumed she was simply trying to help. After all, settling an estate involves mountains of paperwork. Insurance, taxes, bank accounts, property deeds. None of it is simple. But eventually, a small voice inside me began whispering that something wasn't right. Every conversation somehow circled back to the same subject: the estate, the will, the company, the house. Never once did Megan ask which memory of Robert I missed most. Never once did she ask how lonely the evenings had become. She only wanted to know what Robert had left behind. One afternoon, while I was putting away laundry, I noticed the hallway closet door was slightly open. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the small fireproof lockbox sitting on the floor. I'd left it on the top shelf. Someone had clearly taken it down. Nothing appeared to be missing. The folders were still neatly arranged. The passports were there, birth certificates, insurance papers. Everything seemed untouched, except one folder. Robert's estate planning documents had been moved. Someone had looked through them, very carefully. I stood there for several minutes without saying a word. Maybe it had been Kevin, maybe Megan, maybe I was simply forgetting where I'd placed everything. Grief does strange things to memory, or so I kept telling myself. 2 days later, David Ross called, Robert's attorney. He had represented our family for nearly 30 years. His voice was calm, respectful, exactly as it had always been. Linda, he said gently, it's time to schedule the formal reading of Robert's will. I agreed. The meeting was arranged for the following Friday morning. Before ending the call, David hesitated. "There is one more thing," he said. Robert left very specific instructions. He insisted that every immediate family member be present before I opened all of the documents. I frowned. "All of the documents?" There was a brief silence. "Yes," David replied. He was very clear about that. I thanked him and hung up. For the first time since Robert's funeral, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside my chest. I couldn't explain it. I only knew one thing. My husband had never done anything without a reason, and if he had prepared something that needed everyone in the same room, he must have known that one day the truth would matter more than anyone's expectations. The drive to David Ross's office took a little over 30 minutes. I had made that trip dozens of times over the years, with Robert sitting beside me. He always insisted on driving, even after retirement. He claimed I drove too cautiously. I used to tease him that someone had to keep us alive long enough to enjoy retirement. Now I was making the drive alone. The passenger seat was empty. His favorite baseball cap still rested there because I couldn't bring myself to move it. The weather was unusually warm for early October. The trees lining the streets had just begun turning shades of gold and crimson, but I barely noticed them. My mind kept replaying David's final words. Robert left very specific instructions. That sentence wouldn't leave me alone. Robert was never a dramatic man. He believed every document belonged in its proper folder. Every receipt had its place. Every important decision was planned months in advance. If he had left special instructions, there had to be a reason. When I arrived, David's assistant greeted me with the same kind smile she had worn for years. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Brooks. Thank you." She led me into the conference room. Everything looked exactly as I remembered. Dark walnut furniture, tall windows overlooking the courthouse square, a polished table large enough for 10 people, legal folders already arranged neatly in front of each chair. I chose the seat nearest the window. It was where Robert always preferred to sit whenever we came together. Old habits are difficult to break. About 10 minutes later, Kevin and Megan walked in together. Kevin hugged me. It wasn't a long embrace, just long enough to appear comforting. "You doing okay, Mom?" "I'm managing." He nodded and sat beside me. Megan leaned over and kissed my cheek. "I'm glad we're finally getting everything settled." Her words sounded polite, but something about them felt strangely rushed, as if settling everything mattered more than remembering the man we had just buried. She looked around the room before asking David's assistant a question. "Has every document already been prepared?" "Yes." "And the originals are here?" "They are." She smiled politely. I noticed David's assistant glance at her for just a second, before returning to her desk. It wasn't much, just a tiny pause. But I remembered it later. Several other relatives arrived. Robert's younger sister, his cousin, our longtime accountant. Everyone exchanged quiet condolences. No one spoke very loudly. The room carried that strange silence families often have after a funeral. People don't know whether to comfort each other or begin talking about business. David entered precisely at 10 o'clock carrying a thick leather portfolio. He shook everyone's hand before taking his seat. "I appreciate all of you being here." His voice was calm, professional. "Before we begin, I'd like to say once again how deeply sorry I am for your loss. Robert was not only my client for nearly 3 decades, he was also my friend." No one spoke. David opened the portfolio carefully. "There are several matters we'll address today." He paused. "Business ownership, the family home, investment accounts, personal property, and finally," he rested his hand on another sealed folder. "Robert's personal instructions." I noticed Megan watching that folder very closely, far more closely than anyone else. David reached for the first document. Before he could begin reading, Megan suddenly cleared her throat. "If no one minds," everyone looked toward her. "I'd actually like to say something first." David looked surprised. "This meeting normally follows the written instructions left by the deceased." "I understand." She smiled politely. "I'll only take a minute." Without waiting for permission, she stood. She looked around the room with complete confidence. "I think everyone here knows how much Robert adored Ethan." Several people nodded. It was true. Robert loved spending Saturdays fishing with our grandson. He never missed a baseball game, never forgot a birthday, never came home without some little surprise tucked into his jacket pocket. He always said Ethan represented the future of this family. Megan continued speaking. "And now that Robert is gone," she looked directly at me, "I believe the most loving way to honor him is to make sure everything stays with the next generation." The room became very still. Kevin stared at the table. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't support her either. He simply remained silent. Megan reached into her designer handbag. She slowly removed a cream-colored envelope. I found this among Robert's personal papers. Every eye in the room followed the envelope. I believe this reflects what Robert truly wanted near the end of his life. She handed it toward David. It should be read before anything else. David didn't immediately take it. Instead, he looked at the envelope, then at Megan. His expression didn't change. But I saw something behind his eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. Very calmly, he accepted the envelope. He examined the signature on the front. He turned it over once. Then he placed it on the table without opening it. Megan frowned. "Aren't you going to read it?" David folded his hands together. "No." The room fell silent. "Because," he said quietly, "I've never seen this document before. And Robert specifically instructed me that if any new version of his will appeared after his death, I was to stop the meeting immediately and follow the next sealed instruction he left in my custody." No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. For the first time that morning, Megan's confident smile disappeared. David's words hung in the air like a sudden clap of thunder. No one spoke. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Megan stared at David, forcing a smile that no longer looked natural. "I'm sorry," she said with a nervous laugh. "I don't think I understand." David remained calm. "I'm sure you don't." He gently slid the cream-colored envelope back across the table toward her. "I won't be opening this. But Robert gave it to me himself." Her answer came so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. "He updated it shortly before he passed away." David slowly removed his glasses and cleaned them with a soft cloth. It was something Robert used to joke about. When David takes off his glasses, he'd often say, "Someone is about to hear something they won't like." I remembered that little joke at exactly that moment. David looked directly at Megan. "Mrs. Brooks, Robert made it very clear that no amendment to his estate would ever be accepted unless it was prepared in this office, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and entered into our records." He rested one hand on the leather portfolio. "There is no record of this document." Megan's smile faded another inch. Kevin finally looked up. "Megan," she quickly interrupted him. "Maybe Robert forgot to tell David." Her voice was calm, but I could hear a slight tremble underneath. "He wasn't feeling well during his final weeks." David nodded politely. "You're correct. He wasn't. Which is precisely why he insisted every meeting regarding his estate be documented." Again, silence. I looked at Kevin. He seemed completely confused. He wasn't angry. He wasn't suspicious. He simply looked like a man trying to understand a conversation he never expected to hear. David opened another folder. "I believe it's time to follow Robert's instructions." He removed a single sheet of paper. This document was signed 8 months before Robert passed away. He adjusted it carefully before reading aloud. "If anyone presents a document claiming to replace or alter my final will after my death, my attorney is to suspend the reading immediately and proceed to instruction B." Several relatives exchanged puzzled glances. David continued reading. "This is not because I distrust my family. It is because I have learned that grief sometimes brings unexpected behavior from people I once believed I knew completely." My heart tightened. Those words sounded exactly like Robert. Gentle, careful, never accusing anyone directly, yet somehow saying everything that needed to be said. David reached beneath the table and unlocked a small drawer built into his desk. From inside, he removed a dark wooden box. I had never seen it before. It was beautifully made, mahogany, polished smooth. Robert always loved handcrafted woodwork. Across the brass latch was a white security seal with David's signature. He held it up for everyone to see. "This box has remained sealed since Robert delivered it personally." He looked around the room. He instructed me to open it only if instruction B became necessary. No one moved. Even Megan stopped speaking. David carefully broke the seal. The quiet snapping sound echoed across the room. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter, a sealed legal envelope, and another smaller envelope with only 6 handwritten words. "Open only if there is dispute." David picked up the handwritten letter first. "I'll begin with Robert's personal message." His voice softened. "To my family. If David is reading this letter, then something has happened exactly as I feared." Every person in the room became perfectly still. "First, I want Linda to know that none of what follows is her fault. Without realizing it, I pressed my fingers together. Even after death, Robert's first concern was still protecting me. David continued. Linda spent 46 years standing beside me, through every success and every failure. Everything I built belongs to her, before it belongs to anyone else. Tears burned behind my eyes, not because of the money, because I could almost hear Robert's voice saying those words himself. David turned the page. I also ask that no one interrupt until every document has been read in full. He glanced briefly around the room. I intend to honor that request. Megan shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She folded her arms, then unfolded them again. She kept looking toward the remaining envelopes inside the box. Her confidence from earlier that morning had completely disappeared. Kevin leaned toward her. What is all this? She shook her head. I don't know. But she avoided looking him in the eyes. For the first time since arriving, I noticed something I should have seen much sooner. She wasn't worried about losing money. She was worried about what Robert already knew. David laid Robert's letter carefully on the table. There is still one legal document remaining before we continue with the will. He picked up the larger sealed envelope. Unlike the others, this one carried Robert's signature across the seal. And beneath it, in Robert's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words that sent a chill through every person in the room. The truth must come before the inheritance. David held the sealed envelope in both hands for a long moment. No one spoke. Even the relatives sitting at the far end of the conference table leaned forward slightly. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was uneasiness. David looked around the room. Before I open this envelope, I need everyone to understand something. His voice remained steady. Robert specifically instructed me to read every page exactly as written, without skipping a single word. He looked toward Kevin. And without interruption. Kevin nodded quietly. I understand. Megan forced another smile. I'm sure whatever Robert left will clear everything up. Her confidence sounded manufactured now. It reminded me of a student trying to bluff through an exam without knowing the answers. David carefully broke the seal. Inside were several documents clipped together. The first page wasn't legal paperwork. It was another handwritten letter. David began reading. If this envelope has been opened, then someone has tried to change what I spent years planning. He paused only long enough to turn the page. I don't write these words out of anger. I write them because truth deserves protection, after I'm no longer here to speak for myself. I lowered my eyes. That sentence sounded exactly like Robert. He never enjoyed conflict. He always believed facts carried more weight than raised voices. David continued. Linda, if you're hearing this, I want you to remember something. You never needed to fight my battles. That was always my job. My throat tightened. 46 years together. And he was still trying to protect me. David continued reading. For several years, I noticed conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I noticed questions about company shares, property deeds, insurance policies, and investment accounts becoming more frequent. At first, I believed everyone was simply planning for the future. Eventually, I realized someone was planning for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Across the table, Megan lowered her eyes. Kevin slowly turned toward her. She kept staring at the tabletop. David read on. I chose not to confront anyone. Not because I was afraid. Because people eventually reveal themselves when they believe no one is watching. I remembered those last months. Robert had become quieter, not colder, just more observant. Some evenings, we'd sit on the back porch watching the sunset. He would ask strange questions. What do you think matters most after we're gone? Or, do you think money changes people? Or simply reveals them? At the time, I thought cancer had made him reflective. Now I realized he had been putting together pieces of a puzzle I never even knew existed. David turned another page. Several months before my illness became serious, I made a private decision. I asked my attorney to prepare additional legal protections for my estate. I also instructed him to safeguard certain documents outside my home. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. David continued. No one except David knew these documents existed. Not even Linda. I looked at David in surprise. He gave me a small apologetic smile. I honored his wishes. I nodded. I know. Robert had always believed that the fewer people carrying a secret, the safer it remained. David reached the final page of the letter. If you've reached this point, then one final truth must be established before my estate can be distributed. He placed the handwritten letter beside the wooden box. Then he picked up the remaining documents. The top page contained several legal paragraphs. He briefly reviewed them before speaking. This document confirms that Robert authorized additional confidential investigations concerning matters directly affecting the administration of his estate. Megan immediately looked up. What investigations? David calmly continued. They were conducted legally. They were completed while Robert was still alive. They were placed under attorney-client privilege. Kevin frowned. I don't understand. David looked at him with genuine sympathy. I know. But your father believed understanding would eventually become necessary. Megan suddenly pushed back her chair. This is ridiculous. Her voice was sharper than before. If this has nothing to do with the will, then why are we wasting everyone's time? David didn't react. It has everything to do with the will. She crossed her arms. What could possibly matter more than Robert's last wishes? David answered quietly. This is Robert's last wish. The room became silent once again. I noticed Megan's fingers trembling against the armrest of her chair. It was only slight. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. But after spending 46 years watching children hide broken crayons behind their backs in my classroom, I'd become very good at recognizing nervous hands. David reached inside the wooden box one final time. There was only one envelope left. It was smaller than the others, plain white. No law firm logo, no official markings, only Robert's handwriting. David held it carefully. I've waited 8 months to open this. His voice had become almost a whisper. Robert told me this envelope contained the final piece of the story. He looked first at me, then at Kevin, finally, at Megan. I sincerely hoped I would never have to read what is inside. He slid one finger beneath the sealed flap, and as the paper slowly opened, I saw every bit of color disappear from Megan Brooks's face. David opened the final envelope with extraordinary care. No one moved. No one even reached for the glasses of water sitting in front of us. It felt as though the entire room had stopped breathing. He removed a single folded letter. Behind it rested another sealed packet bearing the logo of a private medical laboratory. David looked at the letter first. This is addressed to Kevin. He glanced at my son. Your father asked that everyone hear it together. Kevin swallowed hard and nodded. Go ahead. David unfolded the page. Robert's handwriting was as steady and familiar as if he'd written it yesterday. My dear son, David began, if you're listening to this letter, then something has happened that forced David to open the final envelope. That means someone tried to change my wishes after I was gone. Kevin slowly lowered his eyes. David continued, before you become angry with anyone, I need you to remember that truth should never be feared. Truth hurts for a while. Lies hurt for generations. The room remained silent. I could almost hear Robert's voice speaking those words himself. That was exactly the kind of lesson he used to give Kevin when he was growing up. Never shout, never threaten. Just tell the truth. David turned the page. Several years ago, something happened that I could never explain. It wasn't one event. It was many small things. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Questions about inheritance became unusually frequent. Documents in my office were no longer where I had left them. Most of all, David paused for only a second. I began noticing dates that simply didn't make sense. Kevin frowned. What dates? David didn't answer. He simply continued reading exactly as Robert had instructed. When Ethan was born, I was the happiest grandfather in the world. Nothing will ever erase the love I felt the first time I held him. My heart tightened. I remembered that day. Robert had cried before I did. He held Ethan in his arms for nearly an hour. He kept saying, "He has your nose, Linda." Even now, the memory made me smile through my tears. David continued. But about a year later, while organizing old family photographs, I noticed something that refused to leave my mind. I told myself I was imagining it. I tried to ignore it. For nearly 2 years, I ignored it. Across the table, Megan had become perfectly still. Her hands were tightly clasped together. She hadn't looked at Kevin once since David began reading. Then one afternoon, David continued, I accidentally overheard part of a conversation that changed everything. The room seemed to grow even quieter. I wasn't meant to hear it. Perhaps God simply decided it was time. From that day forward, I lived with a question I could not answer. Kevin shifted uneasily. What question? David looked at him kindly. The letter answers that, he continued. I loved Ethan too much to accuse anyone without certainty. Children should never carry the weight of adult mistakes. So I kept smiling. I kept fishing with my grandson. I kept attending his baseball games. Because none of this was ever his fault. I wiped away a tear. That sentence sounded exactly like Robert. He had always protected children first. Always. David turned another page. Eventually, I made the hardest decision of my life. Quietly. Privately. Without telling Linda. I asked for help, confirming something I prayed would prove me wrong. Megan suddenly leaned forward. What exactly is that supposed to mean? David raised one hand politely. Mrs. Brooks, your father-in-law specifically instructed that there be no interruptions. She sat back again, but her breathing had become noticeably faster. Kevin looked at her. Megan. She shook her head without saying a word. David continued reading. If you're hearing this today, then the results of that decision are sitting inside the sealed laboratory envelope beside this letter. Every person in the room stared at the white packet lying on the table. No one spoke. No one needed to. We all knew what Robert was saying without saying it directly. David carefully placed the letter beside the wooden box. He rested one hand on the laboratory envelope. This package has remained sealed in my office for 8 months. It has never been opened. It has never left my custody. He looked toward Kevin. Your father instructed me to ask you one question before I break the seal. Kevin looked completely overwhelmed. What question? David spoke softly. Do you still wish to know the truth? Kevin closed his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. When he finally answered, his voice barely rose above a whisper. Yes. David nodded once. Then he reached for the seal on the laboratory envelope. Across the table, I noticed Megan's face had turned almost completely pale. She wasn't looking at David anymore. She was staring only at the envelope, as if she already knew exactly what was waiting inside. David held the laboratory envelope carefully between both hands. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the antique clock hanging outside the conference room. No one dared to speak. Kevin stared at the envelope as though it might disappear if he looked away. Megan never lifted her eyes. David slowly broke the security seal. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the room. Inside were several documents, a laboratory report, a notarized affidavit, and a short cover letter addressed to David himself. He read the cover letter first. David, he began, if you're opening this envelope, then my worst fear has become reality. Please remember what matters most. An innocent child must never be blamed for the choices of adults. I closed my eyes for a moment. Even now, Robert's first concern wasn't himself. It wasn't the estate. It wasn't being proven right. It was Ethan. David continued. No matter what these documents reveal, Ethan remains the little boy I taught to fish, the child who sat beside me at baseball games, and the grandson I chose to love. Nothing inside this envelope changes that. Across the table, Kevin covered his mouth with one hand. His breathing had become uneven. David carefully placed the letter aside. He unfolded the laboratory report. I'll read only the conclusion. His voice remained steady. The remaining medical information is private and unnecessary. Everyone nodded silently. David adjusted his glasses. Then he read. Based upon the submitted DNA samples, the probability of biological paternity is excluded. He stopped. No one reacted. Perhaps because none of us wanted to believe we had understood correctly. David continued. The tested male cannot be identified as the biological father of the child. The words seemed to hang in the air. Kevin blinked several times. What? His voice cracked. What does that mean? David looked directly at him. It means the laboratory determined you are not Ethan's biological father. The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Kevin slowly turned toward Megan. His face had gone completely pale. Tell me. His voice was barely audible. Tell me this isn't true. Megan opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She looked toward the window, then toward the floor. Anywhere except at her husband. Kevin asked again. Megan, this has to be a mistake. Still, she said nothing. David quietly folded the laboratory report. Your father requested that I also read his final statement regarding these findings. Kevin never took his eyes off his wife. David continued. Kevin, if you've reached this page, then I am deeply sorry. I hoped every day that this envelope would never need to be opened. I prayed I had misunderstood everything. Unfortunately, facts do not change because we wish they would. My tears finally began to fall, not because of the DNA report, because I knew how much this letter must have cost Robert to write. David kept reading. I discovered the truth nearly 3 years ago. A quiet gasp spread around the table. 3 years. Robert had carried this burden alone for 3 years. I never told Linda because she had already endured enough hardship caring for me during my illness. She deserved peace, not another heartbreak. I covered my eyes. Suddenly, every strange conversation, every thoughtful silence, every late-night walk Robert took alone through our backyard made perfect sense. He hadn't been preparing himself to die. He had been preparing to protect me after he was gone. David continued. I also chose not to tell Kevin immediately, not because he didn't deserve the truth, but because I wanted certainty before I destroyed my son's world. Kevin's shoulders began shaking. He whispered only one sentence. My whole life. David lowered his voice even further. Once the laboratory confirmed the results, I faced another impossible choice. Should I expose the truth while I was alive, or leave it to be revealed only if someone attempted to profit from deception? Every eye slowly turned toward Megan. She remained perfectly still. David read the final paragraph. If my estate is being distributed peacefully, then let this envelope remain forever unopened. But if anyone attempts to alter my final wishes by using Ethan's position in this family, then the truth must protect those I leave behind. David gently placed the letter on top of the report. Silence settled over the room once more. Finally, Megan spoke. Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. She swallowed hard. I never wanted Ethan to get hurt. Kevin looked at her as though he were seeing a complete stranger. You knew. It wasn't a question. You knew all along. Tears filled Megan's eyes. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Kevin whispered. Losing you. Losing everything. She shook her head desperately. It happened before we were married. I thought the timing worked. I convinced myself there was no reason to destroy our family. Kevin stood up so abruptly that his chair slid backward across the floor. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse her. In many ways, his silence was even more heartbreaking. He simply looked at the woman he had loved for more than a decade. Then he asked one question. Did my father know before I did? David answered quietly. Yes. Kevin slowly closed his eyes. And for the first time that morning, I realized this meeting was no longer about an inheritance. It was about a father who had carried an unbearable truth in silence, so that one day, if it became necessary, his family would finally know it too. Kevin remained standing. His chair lay slightly crooked behind him, but he didn't seem to notice. He wasn't looking at the laboratory report anymore. He wasn't looking at the will. He was looking at the woman he'd trusted for nearly 12 years. Megan sat motionless. Tears rolled down her face, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. No one in the room said a word. Sometimes silence speaks more honestly than anger ever could. David folded Robert's letter carefully and placed it beside the laboratory report. There is still one final section of Robert's estate plan, he said quietly. I believe we should finish what he asked us to do. Kevin lowered himself back into his chair. His face looked years older than it had an hour earlier. His voice was flat. Please continue. David opened the final legal folder. This document was signed on the same day Robert delivered the sealed envelope. He adjusted his glasses before reading. I have spent many months thinking about what fairness truly means. Fairness is not revenge. Fairness is not punishment. Fairness is protecting innocent people while refusing to reward deception. I closed my eyes for a moment. That was Robert. He had always believed justice could exist without cruelty. David continued. Ethan has never lied to me. He has never betrayed anyone. He is a child who deserves stability, education, and every opportunity to become a good man. Nothing in these documents should ever be interpreted as a judgment against him. Several relatives quietly nodded. Even Robert's younger sister wiped tears from her eyes. David turned another page. For that reason, I have established a private educational trust for Ethan. Kevin looked up. David continued reading. The trust will pay for his education, health care, and reasonable living expenses until adulthood. The trustee shall be David Ross. David paused only briefly. Neither Megan Brooks nor any other individual shall have authority to withdraw, transfer, borrow against, or control those funds. Megan lowered her head. She understood exactly what those words meant. Robert had protected Ethan, but he had also made certain no one could use the boy to gain control of his estate. David continued. My construction company, investment accounts, retirement savings, and ownership interests shall transfer entirely to my wife, Linda Brooks. I looked down at my folded hands. Robert and I had built everything together. I never cared whose name appeared on the paperwork. Still, hearing him acknowledge that partnership one final time touched my heart more deeply than I expected. David smiled gently before reading the next paragraph. Linda stood beside me when there was no company. She stood beside me when there was no money. She stood beside me during every difficult season of our lives. She owes no one an explanation for receiving what we built together. My eyes filled with tears again. Robert had always noticed the quiet sacrifices, the long evenings balancing bills, the weekends spent helping with payroll when his business was just beginning, the vacations we postponed so Kevin could attend college without debt. He remembered all of it. David continued, "If Kevin wishes to continue operating the company, that decision belongs entirely to Linda. I trust her judgment." Kevin slowly turned toward me. There was no resentment in his expression, only exhaustion. "I'm sorry, Mom." Those 3 words sounded heavier than anything else spoken that morning. I should have listened to Dad more. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You didn't know." He shook his head. "No, I chose not to know." That answer broke my heart, because I understood exactly what he meant. Love can sometimes become blindness, especially when we fear discovering something that might change our lives forever. Across the room, Megan finally spoke. "I never married Kevin for money." No one answered. She took a slow breath. "I know that's what everyone must think." She looked toward me for the first time since the meeting began. "When I met Kevin, I loved him. I still do." Her voice trembled. "But I made one terrible decision before our wedding. I convinced myself I could bury it. I thought if no one ever knew, our family would survive." David listened quietly without interrupting. Megan continued. "When Robert started asking questions years later, I realized he suspected something. I was terrified. So when he became sick, I kept hoping the truth would die with him." She covered her face with both hands. "That was the worst mistake of my life." No one rushed to comfort her, not because we hated her, because there are moments when words simply cannot repair what has been broken. Kevin remained silent for a long time. Finally, he asked the question I think everyone had been wondering. "Did Dad ever stop loving Ethan?" David answered without hesitation. "No." He reached for one final handwritten note that had been clipped to the back of Robert's letter. "I almost forgot. Robert asked me to read this last." He unfolded the small page. "If Kevin asks whether I loved Ethan," David smiled sadly, "tell him this. Love is a choice. Biology is a fact. The two are not always the same." No one moved. David continued, "I chose to love Ethan every single day. Nothing written in these documents changes that choice. If he ever asks about me when he's older, tell him I was proud to be his grandfather." I felt tears running freely down my face, not because our family had fallen apart, because even in the middle of unimaginable betrayal, Robert's heart had remained generous. He had protected truth. He had protected me. He had protected Kevin. And somehow, he had also protected the little boy who had done absolutely nothing wrong. David carefully closed the folder. The estate documents have now been fully read. There is only one remaining matter. He looked directly at me. "Linda, under Robert's instructions, the next decision belongs entirely to you." David's words settled gently over the room. "Linda, under Robert's instructions, the next decision belongs entirely to you." For a long moment, I didn't answer. I looked down at my wedding ring. 46 years. I had worn it through joyful days, difficult years, sleepless nights, and hospital visits. Now I was sitting in a lawyer's office, holding the future of my family in my hands. I never wanted that responsibility. Robert always carried the heavy decisions. I carried the home. Together, we had balanced each other. Now he had entrusted me with the final one. David slid a folder toward me. Inside was the complete estate plan. Every page had been signed. Every signature had been witnessed. Everything had already been decided. The only choice left belonged to me. I could follow Robert's wishes exactly, or I could legally make changes after the estate transferred into my name. David spoke softly. "Robert anticipated you might struggle with this." He reached into the wooden box one last time. "There is one final personal note." He handed me a folded piece of paper. "This one wasn't meant to be read aloud. It's for you." I recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "My beautiful Linda." That was how every anniversary card had begun. I smiled through my tears. "If you're reading this, then you've already carried more pain than I ever wanted for you. Please don't spend the rest of your life carrying mine as well." My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. "You've always believed forgiveness meant pretending nothing happened. I spent 46 years trying to teach you something different. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It simply frees your own heart. I closed my eyes. Robert knew me better than anyone. How many times had I made excuses for people because I wanted peace? How many times had he quietly reminded me that kindness didn't require surrendering wisdom? I continued reading. Do not make your decision out of anger. Do not make it out of guilt. Make it out of love and out of truth. Those two things can live together. I folded the letter carefully. For a moment, I simply held it against my heart. Then I looked across the table. Kevin sat with both elbows resting on his knees. His face was pale. He hadn't cried. Sometimes grief runs too deep for tears. Megan remained completely still. She looked exhausted. The confidence she had carried into that room was gone. All that remained was a frightened woman, facing the consequences of choices she could no longer hide. I took a slow breath. David. Yes, Linda. I intend to honor Robert's wishes exactly as he wrote them. David nodded. I thought you might. I turned toward Kevin. You are still my son. His eyes filled immediately. But rebuilding trust will take time. He lowered his head. I know. I don't expect anything else. Then I looked at Megan. She couldn't meet my eyes. I've spent weeks trying to understand why Robert prepared all of this. I paused. I understand now. It wasn't because he wanted to expose you. It was because he wanted to protect everyone else. She finally looked up. I'm sorry, Linda. I know those words aren't enough. No, I answered honestly. They aren't. Silence settled between us again. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. But Ethan will never pay the price for what happened. Megan covered her mouth and began crying quietly. I wasn't saying those words for her. I was saying them for a little boy who had spent years believing he belonged to a family that loved him. Because he did. Robert had loved him. I loved him. None of that had changed. David closed the estate file. I'll begin transferring ownership according to Robert's instructions. The educational trust for Ethan will become active immediately. The remaining assets will transfer to you over the next several weeks. I nodded. Thank you. The meeting should have ended there. People slowly began gathering their belongings. Robert's sister quietly hugged me. Our accountant shook Kevin's hand. One by one, everyone prepared to leave. Then Kevin suddenly stood again. He walked across the room until he stopped beside my chair. His voice was barely above a whisper. Mom, I'm so ashamed. I reached up and touched his cheek. When you were 6 years old, you broke the living room window trying to hit a baseball. A faint, confused smile crossed his face. You remember that? I remember everything. You cried because you thought your father would be angry. Kevin nodded slowly. He wasn't. No. I smiled gently. He told you that broken glass could always be replaced. But broken honesty was much harder to repair. Kevin looked toward the window. I should have listened to him. You can still start. He looked back at me. How? By becoming the kind of man your father believed you could be. Neither of us spoke again. We didn't need to. Some conversations continue long after the words end. As David escorted everyone toward the lobby, I remained behind for a moment. The conference room was finally quiet. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the polished wooden table where our family's secrets had finally come into the light. I looked down at Robert's final letter one last time. For weeks, I had believed he had left me with impossible burdens. Now I understood. He hadn't left me a burden. He had left me protection. He had trusted me to finish the work he could no longer do himself. As I stood to leave, David walked back into the room. There is one final document waiting for your signature. I looked at him curiously. What document? He smiled gently. The one Robert hoped you would never have to sign. The official removal of Megan Brooks from every position of authority over his estate. I signed the document without hesitation. The sound of my pen moving across the paper seemed almost symbolic. Not the end of a family. The end of a deception. David reviewed the signature carefully before placing the document into the estate file. It's done, he said quietly. From this moment forward, Megan has no authority over Robert's estate, the company, or Ethan's educational trust. Megan didn't protest. She didn't ask for another chance. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time since I'd known her, there was no argument, no explanation, no attempt to persuade anyone, only silence. Sometimes silence is the moment when a person finally accepts the truth. Kevin walked toward the door, but stopped halfway. He turned around and looked at David. May I have copies of my father's letters? David smiled gently. Of course. They belong to you. Kevin accepted the envelope carefully, almost as though he were afraid it might disappear in his hands. "I don't think I'll read them today," he looked at me. "But one day I will. I want to understand him the way I should have while he was alive." I nodded. "So do I." We left the law office together. The autumn air felt cooler than it had that morning. Leaves drifted quietly across the courthouse steps. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then Megan walked toward me. She looked exhausted. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." Her voice trembled. "And I'm not asking for it." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "But I need you to know one thing. I never wanted Ethan to lose his family." I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "He won't." She frowned slightly. I continued. "What happened between the adults is our responsibility. It is not his." Fresh tears filled her eyes. "I've spent every day afraid this moment would come." "I know. I could see that now." She lowered her head. "I'm sorry, Linda." This time, I believed she meant it. That didn't erase what she had done. It didn't erase the years of deception. But sincere regret and restored trust are not the same thing. One is a beginning. The other must be earned. Kevin placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We have a lot to figure out." She nodded silently. Then the two of them walked slowly toward their car. Not side by side, not separated. Just two people carrying a truth they would have to face together. A week later, I visited Ethan after school. He ran toward me the moment he saw my car. "Grandma!" He wrapped his arms around me exactly the way he always had. Nothing about his smile had changed. Nothing about his laugh. Nothing about the excitement in his voice when he asked if we could stop for ice cream. As we sat together on a park bench, watching ducks glide across the pond, he told me all about a science project he was building. His words came so fast I could barely keep up. I smiled the entire time. Because Robert had been right. Children should never carry the weight of adult mistakes. They deserve the freedom to simply be children. A few months later, Kevin asked if he could visit. He came alone. He looked different. Not because he had aged, because something inside him had become quieter, more honest. He carried a small cardboard box. I found these while cleaning Dad's workshop. Inside were dozens of old photographs. Robert teaching Kevin to ride a bicycle, camping trips, fishing weekends, Christmas mornings. There was even one of Robert and Ethan holding the same fishing pole, both laughing at something outside the frame. Kevin stared at that picture for a long time. Dad really loved him. He did. And he always will. Kevin looked at me. I finally read all of Dad's letters. I waited. He wasn't trying to punish anyone. No. He was trying to protect us. Yes. Kevin nodded slowly. I understand that now. He hesitated before asking the question that mattered most. "Do you think, someday, you'll trust me again?" I reached across the table and took his hand. Trust isn't rebuilt in one conversation. It grows the same way your father built his business. One honest day at a time. For the first time in months. Kevin smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile. It carried sadness, regret, hope. But it was real. That spring, the roses in my backyard bloomed again. Just as Robert always promised they would. I spent one quiet afternoon trimming the bushes he had planted years earlier. The garden felt peaceful, not because life had returned to what it once was. It never could. Too much truth had come into the light. Too many illusions had disappeared. But peace isn't the absence of pain. Sometimes, peace is finally living without secrets. Before going inside, I stood beside Robert's favorite rosebush. The evening breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh blossoms through the yard. I smiled and whispered the words I wished he could still hear. "You kept your promise. You protected me. And you reminded all of us that love is measured by the truth we're willing to defend, not by the lies we're willing to believe." As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees, I realized something that had taken me 69 years to fully understand. An inheritance isn't the money we leave behind. It isn't a house, or a company, or a bank account. The greatest inheritance a parent can leave is integrity, because money can be divided, property can be sold. But the courage to choose truth over comfort, that is a legacy no one can ever take away. And every spring, when Robert's roses bloom outside my window, I remember the man who loved his family enough to protect it with honesty until his very last breath. Looking back, I learned that love without truth cannot protect a family, and silence cannot erase deception forever. Robert didn't leave me the greatest gift through his estate. He left me the courage to choose honesty over comfort, even when it broke my heart. If this story touched you, remember this. Never let guilt keep you from seeing the truth, and never mistake forgiveness for accepting betrayal. Sometimes, the strongest way to protect the people we love is simply to stand on the side of what is right.